Dragon Age 2 was initially pitched with the name Dragon Age Exodus, and even just the small inferences we can make from a name change of this manner gives us a lot of context on the game as a whole. If you look at the production expectations behind Dragon Age 2, it was never designed to succeed in the first place. The main team that worked on the game was only given 14 months from start to finish to complete the game and get it ready for production, which is an even shorter development period than the yearly Call of Duty releases between 2005 through 2019. This RPG developer was tasked with creating a follow-up for one of the best received modern role-playing games in recent history, and then told to do it in less time than it takes to make a multiplayer focused first-person shooter, which routinely gets at least a 2-year development cycle. Thankfully, BioWare would never again push a team to get out a game in such a short time span, although they would later run into problems for other reasons. But this was the moment that proved to shareholders that you should never rush an RPG game, as it was met with split opinions across the Dragon Age fanbase on its validity as a sequel to their prior success story. The game sold well enough, with 1 million copies purchased within the first 2 weeks, but the critical and consumer-based reception to the game were less than optimal. And while many fans of the series would recommend that new players skip this game in particular, its role as the bridge between the world state at the end of Origins and the world state as you enter Dragon Age Inquisition is genuinely important to understanding the direction the series is taking as a whole. The development of our knowledge behind the Qunari way of thinking, the evidence of the tension between mage circles and the Templar Order, and even the subtle introduction of red lyrium to the lore are also intrinsically important to the games going forward, with the events of Kirkwall having major consequences on the world as we know it. Dragon Age 2 does drop the ball on several accounts when it comes to wave-based enemies, area design, and story pacing, but the developers working on that 14-month-long timeline put every ounce of their talent into improving the systems behind Origins, to modify the combat, develop better companion arcs, and broaden the player's perspective on world events. My name is JBJett, and I want to take you on a journey through the weeds of Dragon Age 2 as I pluck out every ounce of greatness from this often overlooked title. As you might have noticed, this is the second video in a 3-part series critique on the Dragon Age games, and I would strongly encourage you to go back and watch the first video if you haven't done so already. Dragon Age Origins set up some incredibly important backstory moments for the key characters of Dragon Age 2, with specific emphasis on the characters Justice and Anders that become one of the prime conflict points in the sequel. So if you've got a good foundational understanding of the series, you'll probably enjoy this video nonetheless, but if the video seems out of place in any way or references things from Origins that you should probably know about, this is your opportunity to stop watching and start the series from the beginning. See, one of the most fascinating parts about the Dragon Age games is the way that each game relies upon your experience with the last one in order to build up its story to even greater heights. While Dragon Age 2 could be enjoyed on its own merit, by linking it into the events of Origins and the player's understanding of what happened, it helps to elevate both games to a higher level due to the joint experience between their events. While Dragon Age 2 is derivative from the storyline in Origins, the themes this time around are focused around character building as opposed to world building. As you explored Origins, you were introduced to each section of the world bit by bit as you explored each culture and solved their most pressing concerns at the time. Dragon Age 2 is very different from this approach to storytelling, since it basically assumes that you've got a pretty okay idea what the races are ahead of time, and instead devotes its gameplay to hand-cultivating the story of only about a dozen characters or so over the course of 10 years' time in the city of Kirkwall. You only ever get to directly follow the story of a single character, who also happens to be the player character named Hawk. You get to decide their fighting style and gender, but the actual who they are, where they come from, and what family they belong to is always the same, no matter the playthrough. So, you're playing as the eldest Hawkchild as your family flees from the Darkspawn invasion in Ferelden, and we're introduced to this family as they're beset on all sides by the ravenous necro-orcs. Your father, an apostate mage, is long dead, so your character, your mother, and your 2 siblings are carving your way through the Darkspawn in order to make it to the northern Ferelden border and book a ship to your family's ancestral home, Kirkwall. This entire section is more or less a tutorial as you learn how the basic combat works, how to pick up loot, and are first introduced to the dialogue options in the game. Now, the use of the dialogue wheel in games is a point of hot debate, where many fans of the older dialogue systems from CRPGs like Baldur's Gate believe that the system dumbs down the RPG choices in the game, which is both true and false in different ways. Yes, the dialogue circle can lead your character to say things contrary to what you wanted them to do when the actual line of dialogue isn't actually spelled out. But that isn't actually the fault of the dialogue wheel per se, just the implementation of speech synopsis. If they wanted to, they could still use a dialogue wheel, but also display the full line of dialogue on each section of the wheel, so that's never actually been the fault of the wheel itself, just the consolification of these RPG games. Another argument against the dialogue wheel is that it tends to simplify things into Renegade versus Paragon choices of good and bad, where all the nuance is lost, but then in some of the later Dragon Age Inquisition choices, the dialogue wheel presents you with no less than 6 different connotations to your wording in order to solve the final question in the game, which actually ends up giving you a better representation of choice than you ever had in Dragon Age Origins. And specifically in the case of Dragon Age 2, the game provides you with 3 major lines of thought that encompass the vast majority of all the dialogue choices you could ever make in a game, with friendly choices on top, comedic choices in the middle, and aggressive choices on the bottom. Now this is bound to lead to some conflicting opinions, but the use of 3 consistent dialogue tones allows the player a greater ability to roleplay as a specific character than the old speech choices ever allowed you to do. That statement just relied heavily on your knowledge of the term role-playing as the idea of playing as someone other than yourself. When players want to impose their own place in a world to represent themselves in someone else's situation, yes, the multiple choice dialogue selector is obviously a better choice than the wheel, since you can actually decide specifically what you want to do in their place. But if you instead believe in role-playing as the act of choosing what the character would do instead of what you yourself would do, then the ability to stick to one consistent tone of voice and decision-making ability throughout the whole game makes the dialogue wheel far superior for that specific line of thought. When playing through Dragon Age 2, I found myself sticking to one character type, aggressive on my first playthrough and comedic on my second playthrough, and would often choose my dialogue options without ever even looking at the other choices. In this way, I was playing as the Hawk in that reality would act, every situation, consistently. If you want the choice to roleplay as yourself in the other character's shoes, you can still try to do that with the diverse range of options available for each situation, but the dialogue wheel opens up a new possibility to view the world from the lens of a character who you are not, in a way that the multiple choice dialogue options are unable to do in most cases. What is limiting to some players allows others to experience a character story instead of their own story, a benefit that is so incredibly important, especially in the case of Dragon Age 2, since the game focuses on this character development more than any other game in the series. So with this in mind, now that I'm playing as a character separate from my own choices or beliefs, I get to view those actions without anticipating what I would want them to say in my stead. Thus, when the dialogue doesn't necessarily match what the speech summary indicated on the dialogue wheel, it never bothered me, because I had no idea what the character was going to say before I clicked the button in the first place. Obviously, I was careful around some of the bigger decisions in the game to make sure that I didn't kill off characters before the end of their story or abandon companions by mistake, but even in those cases, I would often approach those major decisions from the viewpoint of Hawk instead of my own beliefs and values, since I had spent so much time listening to the way that Hawk responded to the world around them. I was much more concerned with being faithful to the character than I was to my own heart, which is a unique feeling that you only get to discover when you start to delve into roleplay for hours on end in this way. This also allows the player to get a much better understanding of who their character is on a deeper level than just themselves, since it feels like a different entity from the player despite the fact you have control over their actions. In the case of the Warden from Dragon Age Origins, despite playing as her for 45 some odd hours, I had no idea what she stands for, since I always felt inclined to just pick the choice that felt the most pragmatic at the time. Unlike that, I've seen Hawk act as a terribly violent person who uses her anger to act as a shield for the companions around her, killing anyone who would try and hurt her friends. But another player may have viewed Hawk as an angel at heart who tried to help the downtrodden and mediate between hostile forces as much as possible. As such, I enjoy the dialogue wheel in games specifically because it makes it easier for me as a player to experience different main characters than if I was forced to be the one making those consistent dialogue choices, fully knowing what horrible things the character might say ahead of time. The whole emphasis on picking a character type ended up speeding up the gameplay by a fair bit, as I no longer had to spend time reading my way through several different options at each speech choice, since the answer was almost always chosen for the player ahead of time by following the path set ahead of you. Because of this, dialogue ends up flowing smoother and faster, allowing the speech to seem more naturally paced and make its way through the key points in a discussion much faster than if you spend 30 seconds making a decision each time you want to say something new or meaningful. Because of this, Dragon Age 2 had on average much more time devoted to dialogue than Origins did, with 43% of the typical gameplay devoted to speech in Dragon Age 2 compared to the 30% of gameplay used on speech in Origins. And yet, none of that speech ends up wearing on the player, since it all runs so much faster and punchier than Origins is ever able to do, simply because of the speed of the dialogue wheel in gameplay. This is most evident in the number of times the gameplay changes in Dragon Age 2 compared to Origins. In an hour and 40 minutes of Origins gameplay, the game went from speech to combat to exploration a total of 59 times over a game session, while in a similar hour and 40 minutes of Dragon Age 2, the systems of gameplay changed 108 times, almost double the number of gameplay variations as you could see in the same time period on Origins. This meant that each individual speech interaction, combat section, and walking portion of the game took up around half of the time it did in Origins, adding a sense of variety to gameplay as you experience whiplash going from one style of play to another in quick succession. I'm not saying this is inherently a good aspect of the game, since some people will like the hyped up speed of DA2 and others will definitely not like the action movie quality of every scene. But certainly some interesting statistical differences between the games in that they're both broken up into the same general percentages for each gameplay type, but the fluidity at which they move between those different gameplay sections is wildly different. The thing is, this was a conscious effort on the part of the BioWare developers as they focused on this type of quick cause and effect style action to the game in order to consistently reward the player with something new to see, hear, or kill. No moment is wasted, and the player is in for a hell of a ride as you swing quickly from one questline to another without ever getting lost in the exposition, since all the stories end up relying on the same characters over and over, leading to player recognition of those same people. The game takes place over a full decade, with 2 major 3-year time skips, which allow many of the characters you meet in the beginning of the game to be in a wildly different situation as you tackle the quests near the end of the game. The mage you meet, named Fenriel, and saved from slavers near the beginning of the game, can be turned over to the Dalish for proper training in magic outside of Circle's supervision. Then, almost 10 hours later in the story, you might find out that he's been trapped in the Fade by a sloth demon, at which point you'll have to go in after him and defeat his captors in order to free the boy's mind. Several hours after that, when a couple of years have passed in the game world, you might receive a letter from the boy after he's escaped to Tevinter to live in the only country in the world where mages aren't oppressed for simply being born different. Alternatively, at any point you could have turned him over to the Circle, or even made him tranquil yourself in the dream world, at which point his mother would lose all hope for the boy and commit suicide. It's a deeply personal story that works specifically because you develop this relationship with the man over the course of several interactions and multiple in-game years that allow him to grow independently from your own actions. And what's fantastic about the game is that this isn't the only case of character continuity over time, since almost every single side quest in the game follows the story of characters instead of conflicts. The absolute most important facet of what makes Dragon Age 2 an amazing game for storytelling. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm not quite ready to talk about the main storyline until we address the elephant in the room that is the combat in the game, and how divisive it can be depending on the perspective that you come into the game with. Back in 2011, when Dragon Age 2 first came out, I did not like the combat at all. The lack of a tactical view was so disappointing after playing CRPGs for years and years on repeat that it felt like they had invalidated the game in my younger self's opinion. I wanted another Baldur's Gate tactical style game like Dragon Age Origins, not this silly action-focused over-the-shoulder control. And in a lot of ways, that was because isometric games were all I knew at the time. I was raised playing Baldur's Gate, Diablo 2, Warcraft 3, Torment, Age of Mythology, a wonderful group of games, but all focused on the top-down strategic view, as you were supposed to control several characters with their positioning relative to the enemy and each other. That was what I knew, and that was what I liked, because my only experience with over-the-shoulder controls were platformers like Ratchet & Clank and shooters like the Gears of War series. And with this context in mind, of course I wasn't a fan of Dragon Age 2's combat system, since it wouldn't be until several years later when I was introduced to better third-person RPG games like Kingdoms of Amalur and Dragon's Dogma that I would even believe that over-the-shoulder RPG systems can work well. And I don't think I was the only one who was approaching the game when it came out with this stigma in my mouth before I had even seen what it had to offer. But now that I'm coming back to play the game 9 years after its release, when I have a much better variety of game experience and what to expect from different systems, I found that I genuinely enjoyed the combat system in DA2. In fact, I enjoyed the combat system in DA2 so much that when I went back to the combat in Dragon Age Origins to finish off the last couple of DLCs, I almost stopped playing the game just a few hours shy of finishing the last few bits of content. After getting acclimated to the action focus of Dragon Age 2, Origins just feels so abysmally paced and unbalanced that it's laughable due to a few main reasons. In Origins, the number of enemies that you encounter is defined as soon as you enter combat, since you can usually see each and every monster on the table as soon as the battle music starts. What this means is that a well-equipped mage can then incapacitate every single monster on the battlefield with a few choice spells that not only stun the enemies but also damage them at the same time. Due to the nature of action economies and the fact that almost every monster in the game was just an auto-attacker, stunning the enemy was just about the equivalent to killing them, since all you really wanted to do was stop them from attacking, either by killing them or incapacitating them until they were killed. This meant that the main focus of the Origins system was entirely based upon chain stunning enemies to death, since you could very consistently take out entire packs without even giving them a single action at all. This also happened to mean that combat was very slow, as you were focused on micromanaging several mages in the party as they all attempted to chain together all their stunning abilities, since the monsters had to be tuned to hit really hard in the off chance that they actually got out of a stun for more than 1 second, in order to give the game any sense of difficulty. In order to fix this problem with combat pacing that was so prevalent in the original, DA2 decided that the easiest solution was to throw much larger packs of enemies at the player with much smaller life pools. This has the dual effects of making the player feel much more epic, since every slash of your sword and every fireball may literally kill 5 to 6 enemies at a time, which is really rewarding. But it also allows the players to use stunning spells to disable certain key targets while never giving them the ability to chain so many stuns together that they can lock down the entire battlefield at one time. But then they ran into the problems with combat length. By having players face down giant packs of incredibly weak minion enemies, it meant that combat would often be finished within 12 to 15 seconds, as the player could just unload all their strongest AoE attacks in quick succession to finish off the entire pack at once. So instead of predefining the number of enemies in each battle, every fight had to commence in waves so that all the low HP mobs didn't stack up and get AoE'd down, WoW style. This, in addition to the lack of any tactical viewpoint for the game, made traditional RPG fans furious, since it sent the game towards a much more arcade-like game style than the D&D tactical pursuits of old. It was different, but it wasn't necessarily worse, and this new focus on arcade-style gameplay had some hidden beneficial effects on the game as a whole. Now that enemies spawned in waves, they would typically come at the player from every single direction after this change, making things an absolute nightmare to try and use a tank character. Instead, each class had several sustainment-style abilities and aggro-dropping options in order to lose heat when things started to get dicey. I don't think this was an intentional choice on the developer's side, but on the normal difficulty, this ability for companions to basically tank for themselves means that you don't always need a warrior in every party at this point. When the game undermined the ability of warriors to consistently maintain aggro on new packs, this has the end result of freeing players to use any combination of characters that they might want to travel with, even going so far as to use 3 rogues and a mage in a party without running into any real difficulty due to the lack of a tank. By breaking down the Holy Trinity, it allows players to pick their companions based upon who they like, instead of who makes the best combat team, an especially important distinction in a game so focused on the characters. Now, I won't pretend that I think the developers did this on purpose, but it was certainly an interesting effect that I ended up noticing on my most recent playthroughs after struggling with the focus on Trinities in Origins and Inquisition. Well, after you come to terms with the fact that you do not have any genuine control over the pace or flow of combat, the benefits of such an arcade-like system can start to come to the forefront and aid in the storytelling capabilities of the medium instead of being forced into picking Alistair because he's the primary sword and shield character. I never really encountered that same obligation when it came to Aveline, since she was never able to hold aggro all that well in the first place. On the other hand, there is only a single companion character in the game who has access to healing spells, which means that almost every player will feel compelled to take that character along with you in every party, which almost seems like an oversight in this system, until the point that you realize that the only healer in the game is Anders, perhaps the most important character in the entire game to get a good perspective on the finale. So when the developers realized that their new system will allow players to field a group made up of just about anyone they wanted, they also incentivized players to experience the most important companion to the story by making him the only person that can heal the party other than the main character, if you happen to have chosen a mage. On the other hand, this may feel constrictive to players, like they're being forced into playing with someone they might not necessarily like, but if you're willing to spend some gold on health potions, there are obviously ways to work around this even if you're not playing as a mage. Instead, I think that the developer's incentive to play with Anders in your party is so well nuanced and unconscious for most players that it's a brilliant yet subtle way of making sure the vast majority of players get to know Anders very well without straight up telling them how important he is to the story. And the fact of the matter is, you're going to need to get to know him again, even if you've experienced the Anders character from the Awakening DLC on Dragon Age Origins, because he is more or less a completely different person this time around than the wisecracking comedic relief character that he was in the last game. I never ended up talking about his character during the Origins part of the critique because he was simply an Alistair lookalike character meant to fill the void with his naive one-liners and simple story. Yes, they established his distaste for the Templar Order by mentioning how he's escaped the tower no less than 8 or 9 times by the time we meet him in the story, but for that reason, in Awakening, he always exhibits a lack of self-determination. He has tried to escape his fate so many times before joining the Wardens that he truly has nothing to lose by attempting the joining. Anders was a broken man who assumed that there was nothing he himself could do to contest the Templar Order, since he was but one mage in a world of injustice. And so he hid those feelings of weakness behind a sharp tongue and smart quips. But since the end of Awakening, Anders is a changed man since he ended up bonding himself with the spirit of justice who escaped the Fade with your party back in the Black Marsh. Many players who have had prior experience with Anders from Origins are dismayed to find that he does not always act the same as the jokester that you may have loved from the original, because for better or for worse, he absolutely isn't that same man. Anders will tell you himself that the distinction between himself and justice is so blurred that the point where one man ends and the spirit begins is indistinctive, virtually impossible to detect. They don't act like a dissociative personality disorder where one identity fronts at a time in order to shield the other, except in the event that Anders grows so angry at the mage's plight that Justice takes full control for a short time. Instead, his symptoms are much more subtle in daily conversation, as Justice seems to have picked up Anders' indignity at the treatment of mages across the world in almost the same way that he picked up the Darkspawn Crusade from the dead warden that he last inhabited. And with a sense of self-righteousness that you can only find in a being that deals in black and white, Justice is steering their joint consciousness toward radical beliefs, like the idea that mages and Templars can never live in harmony. Frankly, the character design behind joint Anders and Justice is so ingenious and nuanced in the way it justifies his actions later in the game. It's possibly one of my favorite topics to analyze about the series. But that's a big but. The speed and pacing of the way the Dragon Age 2 story progresses does nothing to help bring great stories on paper into the player's consciousness. In order to touch on this, I'm going to have to continue the plot synopsis from the point we left off in southern Ferelden as your family is being pursued by Darkspawn. Along the way, you meet a fighter named Aveline and her Templar husband who join your group in order to try and survive the trek through the wilds. Unfortunately, your group's combined might is not strong enough to get through the hordes on your own, and your brother or sister, depending on your class, is brutally murdered by a Darkspawn ogre. After you face down the ogre in hand-to-hand combat, your party is about to be overrun by the Darkspawn when a dragon swoops down to set the fields ablaze, before transforming into the Witch of the Wilds and introducing herself as Flemeth. She has a task for someone as strong as you seem to be, transporting a magical amulet across the sea to a tribe of Dalish near the city of Kirkwall, which she agrees to pay for by guarding your escape to the shoreline. In a choice that isn't really a choice, you agree to the task for the safety of your family and set out on the path before you after dealing with Aveline's husband, who we find out has contracted the Darkspawn taint and will soon die. Thus, you make your way to Kirkwall, one of the greatest cities of the north and the largest trade hub in the Free Marches, a country comprised of several great city-states. As you sail into harbor, the statues of anguish that greet you are the remnants of the city's torrid past, as a trading hub for slaves, back when the land was owned by the Tevinter Magisterium. The city has already been overrun by refugees by the time you arrive, and the guards are refusing to allow any newcomers entry to the city, since it's already at full capacity with the poor and the downtrodden. Your mother claims to be from a noble house, as your uncle should still be a wealthy landowner in the city, but when the man finally comes to greet his family, he appears less than wealthy. Despite this, with a few good connections, he's able to guarantee your family passage into the city by selling your services to either the Smugglers Guild or a mercenary company for a year's time. And this is how the Hawk family is introduced back into the city of Kirkwall, as you build the web of connections working for either the underground or as a particularly skilled group of mercenary guards. And this type of introduction is actually quite important to the way that people treat you in the city going forward, since most of the side characters will introduce themselves as friends who have been working with you for years in whatever shady background you ended up picking during the prologue. In the play-by-play gameplay, this writing technique is so natural that you don't even really end up noticing it all that much, and its actual purpose is genuinely cool to see play out as you begin to realize that anyone that claims to be an old friend of yours is actually kind of just an unimportant side character that you can mostly just ignore. By implying an ongoing friendship with the main character, they skip past that awkward exposition and introduction phase and get straight to whatever story beat that person needs to deliver to the player. And since the writers never had to invest any time or effort into setting up the actual character's personality or introduction, they can drop those extras over the side of a cliff without worrying about the player developing any emotional attachment to the character. What can be perceived on one hand as lazy hand-waving is actually incredibly efficient with both the player's time and the writer's level of effort, something that certainly needed to be taken into account given the incredibly short development time that they were given. On the other hand, whenever the player is introduced to someone new to the Hawk family, you can be assured that the person will be of utmost importance to the main plot going forward, a subconscious parsing of information so that the player attaches themselves to the key players and never the unimportant ones. So it is that the player is introduced to the Hawk family's latest acquaintance, the Tethras family of dwarves that is planning an expedition into the deep roads, trying to strike it rich. Bartran, the main brother in charge of the expedition, refuses your employment as guards, but his brother Varric is interested in your reputation in the city's underground and makes you an offer as a new business partner if you're willing to put in the capital. And this is how the game introduces you to its most important aspect, the fact that the vast majority of the side quests in the story are actually main quests. In order to actually go into the deep roads on this expedition, you only technically have to do two things: pay 50 gold pieces and find a map into the deep roads, which is the game's excuse to get you into contact with Anders. What the game doesn't tell you is that there's actually a list of 7 main quests that you have to complete in this act in order to actually set out on your journey, regardless of whether you even picked up those quests at all. The game does this weird thing where Bartran tells you to go finish up anything important before you leave for the deep roads, while your journal might not even have a single other thing you need to do in the main quest section other than going into the deep roads. The whole act is actually paced so well that I never noticed this was something that happened until my third playthrough of Dragon Age 2, because the game will end up pushing you in the direction of these key quests so effortlessly that you'll most likely complete them simply because you're interested in what happens. First, you have to deliver the amulet that Flemeth gave you to the Dalish clan in the area that introduces you to the elves of Sundermount, and establishes Meryl as a companion character, as well as giving you a lore reason for how Flemeth may have come back to life if you defeated her in Dragon Age Origins. The sheer reverence that Meryl ends up giving Asha Belenar when you finally end up seeing Flemeth emerge from the Horcrux is pretty entertaining in retrospect, but not entirely important to anything in the DA2 plot. Next, you're going to need to save the Fenriel character from getting sold off to slavery, as he was trying to escape imprisonment by the Templar. This plotline introduces you to Samson, Sir Thrask, and the idea that many mages are willing to do just about anything to avoid being thrown into the Kirkwall Circle. Along the way, your old friend Aveline, that you escaped from Ferelden with, will ask for your help uncovering a shadowy plot regarding the city guard, which will result in her becoming the new captain of the guard, as well as introducing you to Guardsman Donnic. Likewise, you'll also be tasked to find a missing Templar recruit, which will end up leading you to meet the now Knight Captain Cullen as he uncovers a plot to place sleeper cell demons throughout the Templar ranks and dismantle them from within. By this point, Sir Thrask will come back to you asking for help with a group of mages who have turned to blood magic as they fled the Kirkwall Circle, which you set aright by killing the blood mage Decimus and either freeing or imprisoning the remaining mages, including the apostate Grace. And finally, you'll be introduced to the Kunari in the city by dealing with a dwarf who wants your help hunting down rogue Kunari in the area in order to enter a business deal with the grey-horned creatures. Unfortunately for the dwarf, this deal ends up falling through since they do not respect him, but your involvement with the Kunari catches the interest of Sister Patrice, who asks for Hawk's help smuggling a Kunari mage out of the city to freedom. Once you've almost reached your goal, a Kunari patrol catches up with your group and lets slip that they were tipped off about your involvement with the Sarabas before politely asking for their tool back. Not only does this introduce the way that the Kunari perceive mages as a dangerous tool that must be chained and controlled, but it also introduces Sister Patrice's willingness to disrupt good relations between the city and the Kunari at all costs. And yes, those are all main quests that can't be skipped no matter how early you raise the money to go on the expedition. What's fascinating about all this is that despite playing through the game multiple times, I still thought that many of those quests were simply side quests up until the moment I started doing some more research into the critique. They simply flow so well into the player's consciousness, like it never really feels like you're being forced to do these tasks, because at this point the main character is still looking for any chance they can just to earn a couple more coins. Over time, the game's main quests will start to become more obvious as you focus almost entirely on the Kunari conflict in the second act, and then on the Mage-Templar conflict during the third act. But the broad scope for the money-raising perspective gives the game such an astounding introduction to all these different plot threads from the very start of the game. With all of these tasks complete, the player has already been introduced to the vast majority of the minor players in the conflicts of the third act, as well as a rudimentary study in the guiding values behind the Kunari in the city. And all this is before you even go into the deep roads and discover a resource that would basically cause the conflicts of the third game in the series to exist at all. Act 1 of Dragon Age 2 is a masterclass in exposition because of the simple fact that it allows the player to explore all these new ideas and cultures at their own pace without ever being forced into dealing with them head first. While you're involved in their resolutions, none of the actual conflicts that you deal with were ever about you during this process, since you were never more than a mercenary who happened to stick their fingers into all the right pies at the right time. And then the fuzzy line between mandatory content and side content is blurred even more as you start to factor in all the companion quests, where you get to meet Fenris, the magically tattooed Tevinter slave, Isabella, the promiscuous pirate with a secret that will make the whole city burn, and Sebastian, the DLC religious noble who might as well be a paladin with a bow. Simultaneously, you're dealing with a varied handful of side quests with a similar pacing to them compared to the main quests, like the job finding a man's missing wife that introduces you to the ongoing missing person reports in the city, as well as the detective work of Sir Emmerich. A monster hunt where you clear out a nearby mine with a dragon infestation and end up taking a 50% share in a business going forward. And the magistrate's orders where you track down a criminal fugitive that happens to be using the excuse of demonic possession in order to explain away his serial killer tendencies. Another job is for the Viscount, who is basically the medieval mayor of the city, and needs your help rescuing his son from the Kunari until you learn that the boy was only trying to convert to their religion of his own free will. These are all really good, important stories which flow naturally into the main conflicts of the game, and the player's all-around understanding of the key themes at play. This is how side stories should have been done in Dragon Age Origins, tying directly into the main plotlines instead of tangentially important by means of location-based similarities. The side quests in Origins ask you to go fetch a piece of bark or some random iron as you're passing through the area, while the side quests in DA2 involve saving the mayor's son from the main villain in the second act, or trying to track down a mass murderer who might even target your mother. Even the small number of actual choices that you get to make are more impactful since they directly affect the key players that you'll end up meeting later in the plot. On your second playthrough, you may discover that a lot of the choices you make will only give the impression of change, since the way these plot lines play out, they will basically end up being exactly the same no matter what you do, but at least it puts in the effort to pretend that you had an effect on the world this time around. And if I hadn't gone in for a second playthrough within a month's time, I would have genuinely believed that my choices matter based on the way everything seems to play out so smoothly on your first campaign. But we'll get to that a bit later. First, we have to dive into the deep road so that the Hawk family can earn their great fortune back. After you've raised all the necessary money to become a partner for the expedition, your mother comes to say goodbye and make a final request not to take your sibling down into the deep roads with you, just in case something bad happens. No matter what you do, you'll end up losing your sibling at the end of the act transition, either because you leave them home where they either join the Circle or the Templars, or you bring them into the deep roads where they catch the taint and die, or become a Grey Warden if you happen to have brought along Anders as well. So not only did one of your siblings die in the opening prologue, but then you lose the other sibling to a wide variety of unfortunate events, no matter what you do at the end of the first act, leaving just you and your mother. But Hawk wouldn't know this would happen at the time, so they enter the deep roads, full of hope and ready to make their fortune. Not far into your journey, the expedition hits a roadblock, at which point your skills in battle become increasingly helpful as you fight your way through an alternate route and keep the adventure on its path. During this section, you end up encountering Sandal, a lyrium-addled dwarf who works as an enchanter at his father Bodan's merchant shop. The player probably first met them as the camp merchants in Origins, but back then they seemed to be nothing more than simple throwaway characters to serve as a shop in the traveling party hub. But over the course of the series, Sandal keeps appearing in more and more laughably dire situations, surrounded by the dead bodies of dozens of Darkspawn beset by magic. And while he was most certainly never meant to be an important character when he was first introduced to the series, his growing popularity amongst the fan base makes his growth as a character very possible in future additions to the story. One of those funny, not an Easter egg, but still world-breaking situations that I can't wait to see the series try to explain using an in-game lore, considering the amazing fan theories that already exist on the topic. So with all that said and done, your party finally makes their way to the ancient Tig that was the end goal of the expedition in the first place, where you end up finding a giant vein of this weird red lyrium stuff, along with an old carved artifact that appears like it might be worth some money. The game has alluded to the idea that Bartrand has been a bit of an asshole up until this point, but something ends up taking over him and he locks your party in the Tig after taking the prize for himself. After a little bit of exploring, you end up finding an alternate exit from the area that is being guarded by these magical earth elementals that Varric claims he's only ever heard about in dwarven legends. You soon realize that a demon of greed has been organizing these elementals as it tries to protect the golden horde deeper in the caves, but this always struck me as a weird plot point since it never really ends up going anywhere. Either way, it makes a good excuse for a boss battle with a giant rock elemental thing that ends up taking several phases where it calls in adds and you have to hide behind pillars in order to avoid an explosion, which makes for a pretty fun fight in my opinion. You take as much gold as you can carry before making your way back to the surface with your newfound spoils, and you get to watch a wonderful hand-drawn cutscene as the timeline progresses 3 years and we get prepared for the second act of the game. This is actually a good time to point out the fact that the entire game is a story being told by Varric Tethras as he is being interrogated by a seeker of the Chantry named Cassandra Pentagast. This plot point is introduced in the very beginning of the game as you see Cassandra begin her questioning for the dwarf as she attempts to figure out what actually happened to the champion of Kirkwall, who just so happens to be Hawk. So during every interlude to the story, we get to see a quick glimpse forward in time to the interrogation between Varric and the Seeker as she tries to understand what is rumor and what is the truth behind the story of Kirkwall, for reasons that don't necessarily become apparent until you finish the last act. For now, it's enough to understand that the story isn't always portrayed as full truth, as we'll see several scenes where Hawk is displayed as a heroine of theatrical proportions, and Varric takes out entire platoons of mercenaries single-handedly before Cassandra reels him back in to tell a little bit closer to the truth of the situation. And as a backdrop for the pacing and the combat of the game, it's actually quite ingenious. It doesn't necessarily excuse the fact that the combat is completely arcadified with several waves to every battle and a flurry of blows as your party takes out rank after rank of enemy monsters, but it does at least try to explain the narrative power differences between the hero of Ferelden and the champion of Kirkwall. Even the Inquisitor, who held the power to tear a hole in the veil between worlds, is never displayed with the power to single-handedly murder 30 thugs around every street corner in the same way that Hawk does in DA2. And then the developers somehow realized how fantastical their own story had become and simply wrote in a justification for the exaggeration by making it the equivalent of a fireside bedtime story. I won't deny that I look on the bright side when it comes to the majority of the flaws in the scope of Dragon Age 2's gameplay, but some of the small little storytelling tools that they use, like the context of having Varric tell Hawk's story, and even using the time breaks to their advantage, are just so smart in their efficiency and design. So now that we've entered the second main act in the game, tensions have risen dramatically between the Qunari and the city of Kirkwall over the last 3 years. Their initial justification for being in the city was that their fleet was destroyed in a freak storm, but now that several years have passed and they could have easily sailed away at any time, people are starting to question just why the Qunari are still around the city. Now that you've come back from the Deep Roads expedition and established your power among the nobles, the Viscount calls upon you for help to unwind the tensions between the Qunari and the city folk, preferably by finally convincing the highly militant group to move on before they do something rash. This starts the game's tendency to rely upon the mail system to deliver requests that progress the main plotline throughout the second and third act of the game. Now, it's never as bad as the original Denerim quest boards where you go down the list and thoughtlessly accept each and every task without even looking at them, since all of these letters still require you to actually go to a quest giver and get some more context on what they want done. Instead, the use of the mail system is supposed to imply the passage of time, that even though 3 years pass between Act 1 and Act 2, the actual act itself still plays out over the course of several weeks, instead of just a couple of days, using the letters for context. Or, more likely, it's probably just a contrived way to make sure that you can't trigger a quest until the required context for it is already played out, and the key players are in the right world states for everything to actually make sense. Regardless, Act 2 is comprised of 6 main quests that must be completed in any order to move on to the final chapter. First, the air shock asks you to track down the chemical formula for a poison gas bomb that someone managed to steal from the Qunari compound, which is assumed to be the fault of the dwarf named Jarvey you had worked for before when he was trying to make a business deal with the Qunari. See, Jarvey was trying to buy the formula for a substance called Gatlock, which is the Dragon Age equivalent to gunpowder, but the Qun was not so interested in giving away one of its most guarded secrets. Following his failure to obtain the recipe, the Arishok assumed he tried to steal the secret in the dead of night, and instead ended up stealing the formula for a deadly poison gas instead, so Hawk goes on a hunt for the dwarf before he kills half the city by mistake. When you eventually catch up to Jarvey, he's just as confused as you are by the situation, since it turns out that he wasn't actually the one who stole the formula from the Qunari. It turns out a vengeful elf from the Kirkwall underworld stole the formula, framed Jarvey for this job, and now plans to use it to cause even worse relations between the common folk and the Qunari. Apparently, this elven radical is upset that so many of the city elves in the area have been turning to the Qun as an alternative solution to their poverty and poor treatment by the humans, even further distancing the elves and the Qun from their ancient elven heritage. You quickly deal with the situation and stop the poison gas from spreading further than the initial city block it was released in, but the damage is done and somehow people are already tracing this back to the Qunari. Simultaneously, Aveline will have asked the player to take care of an awkward situation with a Templar named Sir Elmeric, who is trying to investigate the missing person reports in the city. Once you meet with the man, it turns out that he thinks he's got a good suspect for the missing persons, but when the guards tried to do a search of the suspect's home, there was no evidence that Gascard Dupuis was a villain. Conveniently enough, when Hawk personally goes to Dupuy's home, you'll find the area guarded by several demons hiding a scared woman in the deepest rooms of the house. If you let Dupuis try to explain himself, he claims to be connected to the criminal you've been searching for, since he is also trying to catch the man that killed his wife several years ago. The serial killer always sends a bouquet of lilacs to the next victim a day before he abducts them, which is how Dupuis was able to track down and protect this woman in his house before she was abducted. You can either kill him on the spot or let him live, which gives him a chance to help you out in a related questline just a little later on. Going back to the Kunari conflict, the Arishok sends you another letter asking for help dealing with the patrol that's mysteriously gone missing in the Kirkwall Darktown. This time, after tracking them down, you'll end up finding out that a Templar named Varnell, who appears to be holding an anti-Kunari lynching with the missing patrol deep in the sewers. You can either side with the Kunari and fight against the Templar and his fanatics, or you can actually side with Varnell with enough aggressive personality choices and fight against the Kunari after you kill one of them yourself. Regardless, if you try to link this anti-Kunari rally to Sister Patrice, since Sir Varnell was her right-hand man, she will deny any rumors and claim that he was only acting on his own accord. And given how many other people you're allowed to just randomly kill in Dragon Age 2, Sister Patrice is definitely a mischance for a satisfying murder, but the story must go on. When you return home, you realize that your mother has been missing all day, and after you find out that she just received a bouquet of lilacs, everything should be sliding into place in the player's mind as they realize she's just been kidnapped. You'll have to track her down to a secret base hidden in Lowtown with either the help of your Uncle Gamlin or Dupuis, depending on your choices, before dealing with one of the most horrific story beats in the entire game. Once you finally track down the serial killer to his hideout in the sewers, a couple of forgotten letters and diary entries fill in the blanks as you realize that he's been trying to recreate his dead wife in a type of Frankenstein-esque blood ritual. You then walk into the final room only to find out that your mother, she's had her head ripped off and put on the body of this shambling beast that's made up of the different parts from a dozen other women. The perfect recreation of this weird sicko's dead wife, and he probably would have gotten away with it too if he hadn't decided to abduct the mother of the most competent murderer in all of Kirkwall. You destroy him, but that doesn't end up solving the situation. The deed's already been done, and the mother you once had is now trapped in a body that doesn't necessarily belong to her. The scene winds to a close as you kneel on the ground, clutching your own mother as she begs you to end her life so that she can finally rejoin the rest of your family. It's a truly heartbreaking moment, or at least it probably would be if the graphical fidelity of the game wasn't holding it back for this very specific moment. Throughout the majority of the game, I thought that the visuals behind the story beats were neither good nor bad, simply serviceable in most of the gameplay. The combat looks pretty interesting and flashy, but the setting and the character models start to look really dated, especially when the game insists on zooming in on them during all the RPG portions of the game. And in this case, the story hits all the right beats for foreshadowing, irony, and tragedy that it needs to in order to make a good story, but when the game tries to zoom in on the characters in the scene, I can't help but fail to believe that they're real humans. And while these caricatures that act like minstrel puppets validate the idea that it's just one of Varric's stories, for this scene in particular, it just wasn't enough for what they were trying to do. And I think that's a real shame because I don't remember being disappointed by the graphics behind the game when it first came out. But now that standards have changed, the character models have started to look cartoony in a not so artistic way. Similarly, the locations you'll be running around are decidedly pretty bland, with a color scheme of beige, brown, and cream, depending on which part of the city you're running through, but at least this is a step up from Dragon Age Origins. No, most players don't complain about the locations in this game simply because they look bland, but instead because you will be, in fact, going to the same places over and over and over. Each cave is the same cave, each sewer is the same sewer, and every noble's house is a carbon copy of one another, like they only used a single architect for the entire city. And what makes this all the more worse is that the map is fully visible every time instead of blacking out the parts that aren't unlocked for cave trip number 13 this playthrough, making it so much more obvious for any of the players that might not have realized that they were reusing content up until this point. You can try to blame this on the short development cycle, or you can try and blame this on the fact that the entire plot takes place in the same city over 3 time skips, but at the end of the day, they should have done better than this. First, blacking out the parts of the map that you aren't seeing on any particular trip through a map wouldn't necessarily fix the problem, but it would certainly help the situation, especially for those players that aren't taking several trips through the game in quick succession. Second, using the same places over the course of several time skips can be a really cool idea in games, but you must put in the effort to at least try and change up the areas just a little bit, so that the player gets to experience some new things each time skip. The developers even proved that they're capable of doing a good job of this to areas based on the way they use a burning version of the Lowtown and Docks areas during the climax of the game. So why couldn't they have put in the same effort to make the day-to-day game area change just a little bit as well? If we had gotten to see the world grow with our characters as new houses were built or burned down in unspoken tragedies, to explore new shops as they opened and closed each year, to see different weather effects on the city, new streets opening or closing due to construction, really just anything at all to make the return visits to these areas just a little bit more worthwhile to explore. Instead, the gallows that you explore in the prologue to the game look exactly the same and even have the same merchants as you return to the area 7 years later. And all of this in spite of the fact that Kirkwall happens to be one of the most famous trading cities in the known worlds of Thedas. I'm only upset with the game because of how much better it could have been if they had just put in a little more effort and made a Sayscape impressive enough to put the Fable games to shame. Instead, I worry that developers might look at this game as a warning not to use the same areas for long periods of time, instead of learning how important it is to make the game world feel dynamic and lived in with just a little bit of extra work. On the bright side, you never really have to spend more than 30 seconds or so running through even the largest areas in the game, so it could always be worse, but that's not necessarily the type of words that you want to hear about a game. And all this just to get the point across that I think that the game world looks kinda meh? Although it does start to pick up a little bit as we head into the second climax of the game with the end to Act 2 and the Kunari conflict. You remember how we saved the Viscount's son earlier in the game, despite the fact that he was trying to convert to their religion of his own free will? Well, this time he's gone and pledged himself to the Kun for real before going missing in almost exactly the same way as the Kunari patrol that ended up getting lynched. It turns out that Sister Patrice is at it again, trying to instigate a war between the Kunari and the city, and this time she's even willing to kill the mayor's own son in order to try and frame the Kunari for his murder. The player ends up showing up too late, at which point Sister Patrice tries to blame Hawk for the murder and bring it to the attention of the resident Chantry Grand Cleric, a woman named Elthina. Despite all her conniving plans and lies, Patrice isn't able to convince Elthina to declare a holy war, even as she stands over the body of the Viscount's son. And as she leaves, a Kunari assassin creeps out of the shadows in order to take Patrice out of the equation, permanently. But the deed has already been done, and the city stands on the brink of outright disaster as the Viscount weeps over the body of his dead heir. The time for revolution has come, and when you return to your home, your companions Aveline and Isabella will be found arguing over who gets to ask Hawk for help first. Aveline needs your help settling a judicial problem with some criminals that are hiding behind the Kunari and out of the reach of her guards, while Isabella claims to know what the Kunari are searching for in the city, and you might be able to convince them to leave if you just help her search for a holy book. In order to really understand what happens on Isabella's path through the quest, you'll need a little bit more context for her character, so I'll leave that for later when we go over the companions in the game. So the player ends up following Aveline to the Kunari compound in order to determine the fate of 2 elves that were converted to the Kun after killing a man. Once you arrive, the Airshok reveals that these 2 elves were only dispatching justice on a man who raped their sister, since the guards in the city did nothing to help when they tried going to them first. So now the elves have converted to the Kun for both protection and in the belief that the community and rules the Kun provides might improve their lives, since the human-based structure is obviously failing them. Regardless of whether you end up siding with the Kunari or not following this new situation, the Airshok ends up getting pushed just a little bit too far after dealing with the heathen city for so many years, and orders his Kunari Legion to start the attack. What's funny about this whole situation is that even though you've proved your ability to destroy rank after rank of Kunari up until this point, your party is somehow chased off by a pack of maybe 8 spear throwers because of cinematic reasons. Oh well, it gives you a chance to fight your way through the city as you travel through the burning slums, the Hightown Quarter, and eventually confront the Arishok at the Viscount's place where he's taken all the nobles captive. Along the way, the player gets introduced to High Enchanter Orsino and Knight Commander Meredith, the leaders of the Mages and Templar in the city, respectively. Up until this point, the player will have heard quite a lot about these characters and even seen them in a couple of cutscenes, but this is the point where they start to take the forefront. Both leaders want to lead the final assault on the Arishok and will ask you for your help on how best to proceed, either by attacking head-on with the Templar forces, or trying to find a distraction to help the mages sneak in. And while the difference between those two paths isn't very interesting, it does a good job of introducing the key differences between Orsino and Meredith before we head into the penultimate chapter. Now that you've cleared the way into the palace proper, you'll quickly find yourself at odds with the hulking behemoth that started this whole mess. He goes on to explain that the Kunari were only in the area in search of an old relic of the Kun that would have made a drastic blow on morale if it were ever truly lost. And regardless of how the player may feel about the situation, you'll find yourself forced into combat with the Arishok in order to resolve the conflict. If you happen to have played a Hawk that respected the Kunari way of life in the many quests that led up to this point, the Arishok will give you the opportunity to enter an honorable duel to the death for the sake of the city and all of its inhabitants. If you succeed, the Kunari will comply with your rule and leave the city peacefully, and if you die, well...
And if you kill me,
then you are dead.
If you're playing a warrior class built to deal with heavy damage dealers like the Arishok, it can be a very epic moment as the two of you wail on each other for several minutes in a display of pure brute strength. But if you're playing a more squishy character, the fight can quickly devolve into a bunch of kiting and waiting for health potions and stuns to come off cooldown, which undermines the importance and interest of the duel to a certain extent. Either way, Hawk defeats the Kunari leader and convinces the Kunari to leave the city once and for all, whether or not the Viscount that first put you on the task still lives. And given the fact that this is Hawk's story and not necessarily the player's story, I think everything in this act ends up turning out pretty well. If the main character was supposed to represent the player, then I would be appalled by the fact that you don't have any chance to fully side with the Kun during this plotline, but it's not a choose-your-own-story module, only a tale being recounted by a dwarf in a precarious situation, so it makes a good bit of sense. The fact is, the Kunari are always supposed to attack the city. The Viscount would die, leaving a gap in the political structure, and Hawk would be named champion as they well and truly earn the title by facing down the Horned Legion. It's simultaneously strengthened by the Aesop's Fable structure to the entire situation, while also being undermined by the lack of any real nuance to the choices that you have. After learning about the Kun, this religion where each person is actually a smaller piece of the whole and only exists to help further the collective existence of their society, and then being forced to compare it to the moral ineptitude that you had to wade through in the streets of Kirkwall, it's all phrased in the best possible light to show both the strengths and the failures of the Kunari people, as you see them provide a sense of justice that the guards in the city fail to do, while simultaneously robbing mages of any free will of their own as they chain and use them like tools. The structure of the more typical feudal society that the game explores in Origins is easy enough to understand since we've seen it so many times before, but when you're introduced to the Kunari, the best I can compare it to is a type of religious-based socialism theocracy, and from a real-world standpoint, I should absolutely hate even the mere idea of such a system, the antithesis of the American dream in almost every way, but in the context of the suffering and injustice that we end up exploring throughout Kirkwall and even the larger social perspective of 2020, the values behind the Kun can start to look just a little bit more worthwhile, and I found myself siding with their beliefs on the vast majority of topics. So despite framing the Kun from such a villainous perspective to this series, I still found myself empathizing with their group due to the philosophical beliefs that drive their culture. And this is where I think the Dragon Age games start to really shine as we make our way into the later half of the series, where they put in a lot of effort into providing valid and believable rationale behind the villains going forward from this point. But now that I've already made it to Act 3 of the story, things pick up even faster as you explore the final 3 main quests that make up the major conflict between the Templars and the mages in the city. While there are so few main quests linked to this act in particular, the actual build-up for this conflict can be seen across every chapter as you've repeatedly met with mages either trying to escape the city or resorting to blood magic it in order to carve their own way out. Similarly, a lot of the hard-hitting plot points during this act actually end up coming from the final companion quests that wrap up their stories with some suitably heavy ramifications for each and every character. Due to the importance of these side stories during the last act, the actual Mage-Templar conflict during this section of the game ends up feeling like a series of side quests in many ways, as you're tasked with tracking down 3 of the mages that have gone rogue in the city. In 2 of the 3 of these encounters, the mage turns out to be a blood mage who has literally gone mad with power as though they've fallen deep into the thrall of the demons from across the Veil in order to receive the power they needed to break free from the Templars. One mage murders his wife in front of your eyes for just a little bit more blood power, while the Ferelden foster mother threatens to eat her own children because they've annoyed her. The final mage you're tasked with tracking down happens to just be a happily drunk man who's experiencing freedom, booze, and women for the first time in his life, in what happens to be one of the saddest moments out of all 3 of these scenarios. The elven husband drew upon blood magic in order to return to his love. The foster mother drew upon the power to feed the children she cared so much about, while the mage at the bar bragged about being a blood mage so that the girls around him might think that he was just a little bit more interesting. These are the fates that befall the mages from the Circle of Kirkwall, and while they are equal points terrifying in their power and rage, they also show the weakness and incapability to assimilate into normal life that comes from a life behind the cage. I've been bringing up the backstories behind all the main quests up until this point because no matter how small or unimportant they might seem in the short term, they all serve to expand the player's breadth of experience with the factors in this conflict. Every single quest from the very onset of the game revolved around 2 major conflicts, the tension between the Kunari and the Chantry, and the struggle between mages and Templars. And the final quest before the point of no return ends up pulling together all of these characters in a final last hurrah. After finding the 3 missing mages in the area, either Orsino or Meredith will give you a task to track down a rebel group comprised of both mages and Templar that don't agree with the status quo. On the shores of the Wounded Coast, you'll end up finding the rebel group as you run into Samson, Karen, Thrask, Grace, Cullen, and even Bethany or Carver if they're still alive, as all the side characters you've been introduced to up until this point start to pay off in the conflict. And on your first playthrough, this feels like a really rewarding moment, since all of your choices seem to be acknowledged during the scene, but in reality, Karen will join the rebellion whether or not he remains a Templar. Thrask will lead the group no matter how many times you betrayed or helped him in the past. Grace will join their ranks regardless of whether you let her go free or had her join the circle, and your sibling ends up showing up as the hostage regardless of whether they join the Templars, the Circle, or the Wardens, just so long as they're still alive by this point in the game. It's the perfect storm of making the player feel like all their choices mattered and actually just playing out exactly the same no matter what you chose to do earlier in the game, and probably the best example of everything that people either love or hate about Dragon Age 2 as a whole. Origins and its sequel end up taking completely different approaches to the problem of integrating player choice. Origins always insinuated that your choices would have an effect on thousands of people at a time, dramatically altering the progress of entire races, and they were able to get away with this by never showing those effects in-game outside of the epilogue slides. While in DA2, they ended up focusing on smaller stories where the choices are so minute that even the differences between sparing and taking a life starts to seem meaningless when the organizational leaders like the Arishok, Orsino, Althena, and Meredith exist and will take the same actions almost no matter what you do. Because of this, you do end up getting a couple of choices that have knock-on effects, like the choice of whether to spare Dupuis or to encourage the strange Tal Vasoth to take up mercenary work, specifically due to the fact that those choices are really easy to implement since they're so low stakes. Thus, when a quest starts to run into possible problems with the main storyline, the choices you have start to dwindle quite rapidly, since the game was only ever supposed to be a transition period for the series in between the true heroes that affect the world more than just a city at a time. This is the story of Hawke, and no matter how many lives you save or take at the end of the day, your character was always destined to take the same path and set the stage for what comes next. What came next for the rebel group was that they all end up getting slaughtered, either by you, the Templars, or by each other, as the whole scenario comes crashing down now that Grace, the Blood Mage, reveals her true hatred for Hawke after you killed her husband. Cullen mops up the scene as you return to the city leaders, and tensions rise even higher despite the fact that the rebel group has been dealt with. The next time that you return to the gallows, things really start to go off. Orsino and Meredith have started fighting again, and some Templar are dispatched to go get your help during the situation. In this moment, Hawke can either personally bring the different factions to all-out war, or resolve the situation peacefully up until the point that Anders, the spirit of vengeance incarnate, decides to blow up half of the city in a sweeping cinematic that makes his magical explosive device look like the equivalent to a nuclear bomb. The game wants this moment to feel big, to feel momentous. It shakes the beliefs of everyone nearby that such an atrocity is even possible, that one mage with enough time and knowledge was enough to single-handedly dismantle the only mediating force left in the city, since Grand Priestess Althena was the only thing keeping the mages and Templars from tearing each other's heads off. Meredith reacts quickly and calls for the right of annulment to kill every single mage left in the city of Kirkwall. None of them can be trusted. They've pushed too far, and even the most passive of mages are now considered a threat to society. It's a powerful moment to see a person that many perceive as the true leader behind Kirkwall now that the Viscount is gone, demanding a genocide for an entire group of a minority people. Hawke must now take a side in the final conflict, ally with either the mages or the Templar in order to cut your way through hundreds of innocent goons as you approach your way to the Templar seat of power in the gallows. The end result is the same. You assault the circle, dislodging enemy mages or Templar, depending on your choices only moments before, until you make it to the back rooms of their labyrinthine cloister. Now that his rival has crossed the line, Orsino grows desperate and resorts to blood magic in order to bond the bodies of the fallen mages around him into a flesh golem using his own soul. And as you would expect given any experience with the golems of Garak DLC, you'll immediately recognize this fight as the same exact boss from the Origins side campaign. It's not necessarily a bad boss, and my realization why it was so similar was almost nostalgic in my glee, so I think this ended up working in the game's favor, pulling back a boss that the vast majority of the player base never got to see, since it was hidden behind such an unknown DLC pack. But instead, this boss fight is overshadowed by the fact that Orsino will end up taking this path, no matter which side you chose to ally with, which ends up making the entire situation feel a little bit pointless after you've just murdered hundreds of Templar in order to reach him in the first place. As you head outside after this fight, you'll finally meet back up with Commander Meredith, who seems like she's becoming increasingly unhinged. Even if you sided with her in the battle, she'll accuse Hawke of being the center of everything that went wrong with the city. Anders was your friend after all, and your other compatriots include a blood mage Meryl, Isabella the pirate who led the Kunari to the city, and a lyrium-infused Tevinter slave that might as well be a Magister spy for all Meredith knows. It's all too much of a coincidence, and Hawke must be executed so that order will be established in the city once again, a demand that no one in your party takes very kindly. Meredith makes her own enemy out of the player, even if there was no malice in your soul to start with. And then we begin to understand just what is happening when her sword is revealed to be a shard of pure red lyrium, the substance that made Bartrand go mad at a moment's notice, and something that drives the Templars towards insanity even when it's in its more mild blue form. Meredith seems to invoke the very gods as she uses the energy from this red lyrium to animate the bronze statues that once warned the new slaves coming to the city. And as a result, it all ends up feeling quite epic as you face down these behemoth animatronics, as all your companions that are still with Hawk join the battle regardless of whether you chose them for direct control in the party or not. Even the Templars end up joining you in this battle as they realize the sheer insanity that has infected their commander. So while the actual mechanics behind this fight are probably the weakest out of the 3 main boss encounters in the game, it makes up for it by throwing the lives of your friends on the line as everyone comes back together for one last push to make the city safe again. This moment, this final climax of the game, is well and truly defined by the friends that you bring along, like almost everything else in Dragon Age 2. My favorite moments throughout the game always came from the companion quest lines, trying to learn just a little bit more about the people Hawk found themselves dragging along on this wild ride, especially when their stories lead to some of the most profound moments in the final act. If I wanted to cut my video length down in size, I would use this opportunity to choose my favorite companion arcs to go over in particular, but when I sat down and thought about it, each one had such merits to it that it's not quite so simple as pulling a couple out of the crowd and ignoring the rest, especially when we have to take into account that all of this flows into Inquisition. Meryl is like a peek into the idea of what a young Solus might have looked like. Varric happens to have one of the greatest explorations into depression over the course of several games, and Anders is struggling with the question whether it's better to be powerless over your own life or try to become the new oppressor. Even Isabella, the token harlot, ends up getting a valid explanation for why she views sex as meaningless, while simultaneously hating the Coon. So after spending so much time exploring the deep roads, ending the Kunari threat, and triggering the greatest mage rebellion in recent memory, it's the stories of this ragtag group of misfits that ends up holding together the pathos of this game. Aveline is the first companion character you end up meeting in the game, and while her character build-up is a pretty bog-standard do-gooder stereotype, they still end up throwing in some interesting tidbits, especially if you end up taking the rivalry path with your MC. Following the events in southern Ferelden, Aveline feels almost indebted to the Hawk family and will be one of your strongest supporters no matter what you end up doing in the city. This familial bond between yourself and the guardsman only ends up growing stronger as you eventually help her discover a corruption in the guard that ends up resulting in her becoming the captain of the guard by the second act. Obviously, this plot point is too key to the story to just be left to chance by the writers, so even if the player isn't the one to help her root out the old captain's dirty secrets, she'll end up paying another group to do it in your place. In Act 2, her character ends up opening up just a little bit more to the player as she sends you on various errands to help her court one of the guardsmen she's taken a fancy to. It's played off rather comically, with her initially trying to send him gifts with no explanation, then misinterpreting his purpose as a guard by putting him on all the easy shifts in Hightown. Despite being married once before, her attempts to woo this man are so inept it's like watching a 13-year-old boy asking a girl to the school social for the first time. So this strong-willed woman, who serves as the sword and board for your party, as well as becoming captain of the guard for the entire city after living there for only a year, is taken down just a couple of notches as her weakness is revealed to be boys. I think the whole character arc ends up shaking out pretty well in the favor of female empowerment, since she eventually grows to overcome this uncertainty about Guardsman Donnic while simultaneously remaining one of the most powerful characters in Kirkwall throughout the game. Whether she ends up romancing Donnic or failing based on your actions, when you get to Act 3, she seems like she's about to tear her hair out due to the massive surge of complaints about the city guard. Once you track the complaints back to a small anti-guard organization, we find out that it's being led by the corrupt guard captain that Aveline replaced back during the first act. No matter where the complaints are coming from, the dissent in the city still ends up shaking Aveline's beliefs in her own abilities as a captain. After all, the Kunari insurrection happened under her watch, and now that the mages and Templars are at each other's throats, Aveline isn't so sure of herself by the end of the game. Nothing ends up coming from this, it simply is the way that it is, as we watch a good person torn between the duties to the city, to her guards, to her friends, and to the people. Aveline is just trying to do her best while being confronted with a never-ending slew of terrible situations. Ironically, Meryl is in a very similar situation, but with a completely different focus. By the time we meet her character, Meryl has already made a deal with a demon of pride in order to get its help cleansing the darkspawn taint from the Illuvian she ran into back in Ferelden. The Illuvian her story ends up revolving around happens to be the same exact mirror as the one that you encountered during the Dalish origin story back during the original game, and Meryl believes that its reconstruction will be a great benefit to the elven people, and might even save her tribe, but the keeper that she has been studying under disagrees with its importance and orders her to stop her research and leave the tribe. Despite this threat, Meryl continues to invest her time into the Illuvian and eventually requests for Hawke's help in the process several times. First, she needs an ancient elven carving device from the tribe that pushed her away, and invokes the right of Vir Soluvinan to trade a service to the tribe for the tool. The keeper reluctantly agrees to her request so long as she goes into the mountain caves and kills a Vartaral that's been murdering the elvish hunters in the area. The irony in this situation is that we learned from the Witch Hunt DLC from Origins that the Vartaral are actually an elvish creation, developed to act as immortal guards for the ancient artifacts and places of power. Even though you end up killing the beast in exchange for the tool, it will eventually revive so long as the prison of Sundermount and the resting place of the Pride Demon Meryl made a deal with still exists. Along the way, you'll meet one of the hunters that was trapped in the cave, but instead of escaping to freedom when you arrive, he runs from Meryl straight into the maw of the Elven Guardian. It's later revealed that the Keeper had warned the elves in the tribe that Meryl might be carrying the Darkspawn taint due to the research she has been doing on the Illuvian, indirectly causing the death of the poor boy. After the next time skip as we enter the final act, Meryl asks for your help one more time since she wants to go directly to the Pride Demon imprisoned in the mountain and ask for its knowledge. She brings along Hawke for the exchange since the demon has gone mysteriously silent for the last couple days, and Meryl isn't quite sure what that might mean. So once you eventually make your way up the mountain, you're confronted by Keeper Marathari, who decided that the best course of action was to free the Pride Demon in Meryl's place. Marathari believed that the Pride Demon intended on tricking Meryl into rebuilding the mirror so that it could escape the Fade through the mirror and enter the world without a human shell. So instead of letting the demon take Meryl's life as its first victim in the real world, she gave her own life to trap the creature in a mortal shell and make it vulnerable. By the end of the fight, you're more or less forced to take the life of the Keeper as she fails to contain the true power of the Pride Demon, and Meryl simultaneously loses her mentor as well as the strongest tool she could have used to rebuild the Elven artifact. As the party leaves the mountaintop, a group of elves ends up stopping you, and only allows you to leave the area if you publicly blame Meryl for the loss of their Keeper. Otherwise, you're forced into a prolonged battle where you end up murdering every single elf in the tribe, as they practically run onto your sword in despair. It's a brutal moment walking through all the dead corpses of the elven settlement that used to be a bustling camp, especially when you realize that Meryl was by your side the entire fight, throwing fireballs and inflicting horror on her friends and family that she was supposed to lead one day. Understandably, she's distraught by the entire situation as you return to the city and may either destroy the remnants of the Illuvian herself or continue her research in the hope it might one day make up for the loss of elven life that happened that day. The game doesn't really do a good job of pointing this out, but the Demon of Pride in the story is specifically named Audacity, and there's a beautiful moment where the player can realize that the demon probably never even targeted Meryl in the first place. No, Meryl was just a tool for the demon to latch on to the true prize with Keeper Marathari. Despite her hunger for knowledge, Meryl always acknowledges the danger that spirits can represent and utilizes them as a tool with equal parts patience and care, like an engineer handling the radioactive material in a nuclear power plant. And yet, despite her care and the fact that Meryl never once ends up bringing a demon into the material world, the Keeper doesn't trust the girl's skills. Marathari is old and wise into the world, and the tools that Meryl is using are something she doesn't totally understand, so she tries to forbid it, despite the good it might do for her people. The Keeper even goes so far as to lie to the tribe and tell them that Meryl has been infected by the demons, a falsehood that ends up leading to the death of one of the elvish hunters that is so scared of the girl he'd rather face a dragon killer. And finally, when Meryl is just at the brink of success, the Keeper decides that it must be a trick of the demon. She does not believe in Meryl's ability because she has not done anything of its like herself. Instead of learning alongside her apprentice, pride gets the better of her, and Keeper Marathari personally frees the demon that Meryl had been able to harness up until this point. She claims to have done it for the girl's own safety, but there was never any certainty that she would have failed up until this point. As such, it's Marathari's own audacity to think that she might know better than her young apprentice that leads to the Pride Demon's freedom. An assumption based upon the fact that she doesn't even understand that the ancient alluvians don't actually lead to the Fade, but instead to land between both worlds. She thought she knew best and ended up leading her own tribe to fall upon their swords in her own haste. It's a sordid tale regardless of who you think was truly in the wrong during the situation, and probably one of my favorite companion quest lines in the series. Similar to how the Meryl storyline requires the players to think a little bit harder about the real context behind the plot, Varric's companion quest shows a really nuanced descent into depression over the course of the 2 games he stars in. While his jovial nature is initially a result from his roguish occupation, over time we start to see Varric use it as a type of coping mechanism for the atrocities that he has to contend with over the course of the series. Since Varric was the man who pulled the Hawk family into the Deep Roads expedition, he ends up feeling a lot of the blame for what ends up going down in the Taig, and ends up feeling even worse if your sibling ends up getting caught in the crossfire. Then there's the fact that his own brother betrayed Varric for what amounts to a small enough idol to hold in a single hand. So after the time skip, Varric learns that his brother has come back to the city and is holed up in the family estates, at which point he asks for Hawk's help to once again face his brother. As you explore the estate, it grows more and more evident that Bartrand locked himself into the building with a small band of mercenaries before he set about torturing them all one by one out of a misplaced sense of paranoia. His brother didn't just betray Varric, he ended up going well and truly mad with his obsession over the red lyrium idol, even after he sold it to Meredith. As such, there's a touching moment where Anders can momentarily breach the Fade and return Bartrand's mind to him for one last goodbye to his brother. The heir to the Tethras family wants you to kill him, begs you to put an end to his madness when you might otherwise be forced to send him to an insane asylum. And I don't think there's really a good choice to be made in this situation. Varric was always the go-lucky one in the family, happy to spend his time hopping from bar to bar while managing the spy network for his other brother, but now he's alone. Whether you killed the brother or not, his mind has left him either way, and no amount of coin can make up for the loss of his family. In the final act, Varric needs your help one last time since the real estate agents are complaining that the house that Bartrand has been using has been haunted. And as you make your way through the house during the quest, a bunch of weird things happen, like doors opening and closing when no one's there, and the pots and books in the rooms flying around like they're possessed. I actually think the entire scene is really well done, and even though the mechanics behind what is actually haunting the place are never truly explained, the way the pots end up flying around the room was just really entertaining to my cat-addled brain for some reason. As you finish exploring the house, you face down a spirit-possessed golem before uncovering a shard of red lyrium that Bartrand must have left there when you cleared him out of the place. This time it's Varric's turn to act weird, and he suddenly becomes very possessive about the substance, partly because he believes that studying it is the only way he might be able to free Bartrand from his madness if you left him in the asylum. I like to think that Hawk is the only one keeping Varric from going straight off the deep end like Bartrand did when you first encountered the stuff down in the Taig. And even if you let Varric keep the sliver of red lyrium, he ends up being really careful with it and the research he has done on the substance. On top of all the family issues the dwarf runs into, he also has his entire backstory with Bianca on his mind, as well as being personally involved in the Kunari takeover and the Mage Rebellion when he was only ever interested in making a profit off of the Merchants Guild. Varric becomes a different character in Inquisition in a very similar way to how Anders changed since Awakening, even though he doesn't have to get possessed by a spirit in order to have his life-changing perspective on life. Talking about Anders, his story is incredibly divisive based on the fact that many people have trouble differentiating his personality in Awakening from the way he acts in Dragon Age 2. See, by the time we meet Anders, he's already joined one of the most talented military groups in all of Thedas and made it through a trial of combat involving several thousand Darkspawn over the course of just a few weeks with the hero Ferelden. He then culminates this experience by confronting the creature that started the Fifth Blight, facing down an army of cannibal super Darkspawn, until finally defeating a super intelligent Darkspawn matron that is comparatively just as powerful as an archdemon. So up until the point he joined the hero Ferelden, his crowning achievement was peacefully escaping the lowest security mage tower in Ferelden a total of 8 times, and getting captured and brought back all 8 times. This character started with a forced comedic charm that was caused by a lack of faith in his own abilities for self-determination. Similar to the mage that bragged he used blood magic as a tavern story, the boy we met in Awakening had no idea the type of power that he held in his hands until he was forced to learn to use it via the murder of rank upon rank of monsters. And you expect this man to act like he did when we first met him, like he hasn't just been turned into a killing machine by the twisted fate of coincidence? So by the time Hawke ends up meeting Anders, he's not only taking control of his own destiny with the self-determination he's developed through combat skill, but he also has a spirit riding along in his head, constantly encouraging him to destroy his enemies in the name of justice. Making Anders any less of the absolute asshole he is to the rest of the party would be a disservice to his overall growth as a character over the course of the series. And if you look at it from this perspective, there's a good chance that he was purposely trying to distance himself so that no one else would get hurt. This is especially evident as we explore his companion quest, where we get to see him lose almost total control to vengeance whenever he lets his emotions get the better of him. First, there's the situation where you have to save a friend of his that's about to be turned into a tranquil, but you get there too late and the mage has already been cut off from the Fade and his ability to show emotions. Like your average tranquil character, they always seem quite content with their situation in life, like a forced lobotomy isn't so big of a deal, which makes a bit of sense when you realize that they're not even capable of feeling anger anymore. But this time Anders is here, along with his random ability to open momentary breaches in the veil. So for the first time in the series, we actually get to see what happens when a Tranquil is reunited with the Fade, and consequently their feelings.
I would rather die a mage than live as a Templar puppet.
And with only a single line, BioWare establishes a justification for why every single player should disagree with the practice of forced lobotomy, regardless of how conveniently portrayed it might have been in the first game. After dealing with this, Anders loses control of himself and wipes out a couple of Templar in order to calm his anger a little bit before dealing with his friend. Oh yeah, and this friend of his named Carl, he was Anders' gay lover for several years and the only man who was ever able to convince Anders not to run away from the Circle every chance he got. When Carl was transferred to the Kirkwall Circle, Anders escaped the tower once again and was caught trying to book passage across the sea to reunite with his first love, an escape that earned him an entire year of solitary confinement leading up to the point that Uldred staged the coup, and within 2 sentences, I completely changed the entire context of this scene, from a random mage to the only thing that might have been holding Anders back from setting out on a path of complete and total vengeance upon the Templars. The stories that Dragon Age 2 tries to tell are amazingly good, but presented in some of the worst ways you could ever imagine. Despite being one of the most forward-thinking magical researchers with a healthy respect for the dangers that demons possess, Meryl is presented as a ditzy child with almost no social experience. It's almost impossible to parse out the fact that Varric was in charge of a spy network of substantial size through the in-game exploration of his character, and Isabelle is practically a stone wall as far as backstory goes, unless you decide to romance her. It's just such a damn shame that we have to watch Anders euthanize his best friend that he's been trying to catch up to for the last several years. And it holds just about as much emotional resonance as a puddle, since many players just met Anders 5 minutes ago. But we can't change the past now, and as we move on to Act 2, this time Anders needs our help tracking down a Templar who's trying to tranquilize the entire Kirkwall Circle, one innocent at a time. We catch up to him just as he's about to take the mind of a young elf, which enrages Anders to the point where his bloodlust isn't quite sated by the time the girl is the only one left. If you haven't reached a certain friendship level with Anders by this point, he will outright kill the girl without ever realizing what he's doing until it's too late. Anders has started to become a threat to the very people that he's devoted his life to protecting, a fact that probably plays a very large part in him losing any hope of lasting much longer. His conscience is dead, his mind holds a very real demon constantly leading him to violence, and he's just seen himself become the very monster he's sworn to stop. Anders has nothing left to lose. In the third act, Anders proposes a way to separate himself from justice to the player. He just needs your help gathering a couple of materials. A couple trips to random locations to search through trash heaps, and you have the stuff he needs, but now he needs your help getting into the Chantry without being seen, which Hawk obviously thinks is suspicious. No matter how much Anders likes you, by this point he won't reveal what's about to happen, and he'll do it all with or without your help, so you might as well just show a little bit of compassion to a man who's already dead inside. We know what he set up in the Chantry, but the best that Anders can tell you is that he didn't want you getting involved, didn't want you taking the blame for what he was about to do, because in his own mind, it never mattered what happened to him after the point of no return. When the bomb finally explodes in the final scene, Anders accepts his fate and takes a seat to stare into the face of what he'd just done. The girl in the caves was just the proof he needed to understand that he was a menace to society, that he could never become the caped hero the mages needed, but with a life that wasn't worth living, he knew that he was the only one that could push the rest of the world over the edge with his dying breath. And if you choose to kill him, to enact justice for the innocents that he just killed and all the innocents about to die, he's sent off with a smile. Because that was always going to be what was best for the mages. This was Anders' story, a life of pain and loss and good deeds that never went unpunished, and one of the most important reasons why Dragon Age 2 is actually a masterpiece. The only way I could ever follow up on Anders' story is to explore Isabella's companion quest, and almost more importantly, her romance plot. See, Isabella does not do a good job opening up to the player unless you romance her, even past the point of just having sex with her. Sex is an easy thing for a girl like her who grew up being a pirate, so it's the act of promising yourself to her after the fact that starts to open up the clamshell and see the pearl inside. Isabella is from the country of Ravane, which is similar in tone to the Assassin's Guild of Antiva, except more focused on the naval aspects of the underworld given their peninsula-type landmass. Her mother was a scam artist who traveled from town to town, artificing her way into a bit of coin whenever she could. But by the time that Isabella was 16, her mother had fallen in love with the coon, while the young girl had not. Instead of taking Isabella along by force, the mother sold her off to a nobleman on the bare promise that he would take care of her, a case of abandonment that Isabella would never truly forgive. So after becoming a forced bride, Isabella was more or less pressured into non-consensual sex for several years, a fact that later developed into her relaxed views on the pastime as nothing more than a physical act. But the nobleman kept trying to pressure her into becoming a stately type of woman instead of the street urchin she had grown up accustomed to being, and she rebelled by taking in an assassin lover from the Antivan Crows named Zevran. The young elf taught her the many ways to use a dagger, which only encompassed the bad behavior that infuriated her husband at the time, to the point that he eventually decided to simply arrange her release to a business partner of his for personal reasons. But thankfully, Zevran learned about the plot, and the husband didn't last more than a week before Isabella was off with a pair of daggers and a purse full of jewels to make her own fortune on the sea. Her tales on the high seas involved many stories of knife fights for the right to command, incestuous teacher-apprentice relationships with captains, and more than a couple of brigands who went mysteriously missing in the dead of night. But the true important part of her story lies in her mother's betrayal for the Coon, and her exchange to a man who never truly loved her. So as we go from one extreme to another, the Isabella that we actually get to meet in the game usually doesn't tell the player any of this backstory that makes her so interesting, and instead only reveals bits and pieces of truth covered in lies when you take the time to actually romance her. She has every right to be jaded as a person, but that doesn't necessarily make it easy to flesh out her character given what little context you might get from her actual dialogue. And the actual tasks that she asks you to embark on throughout the first 2 chapters never really serve as more than a petty distraction. Supposedly her ship crashed while she was carrying an important relic near Kirkwall, and the man who paid her to bring it to him is rather displeased with the situation. Regardless, we help her kill a group of bounty hunters that was sent out to find her, and then we set up a merchant for dubious wares at the back of the Hangman Bar, but nothing really important happens until the end of Act 2, when Aveline and Isabella get into a fight in your home. If you experience some of Isabella's backstory, or you have a good idea of what is about to happen, you might choose to take care of her task first and find the Kunari relic hidden away in Lowtown. Regardless of how much she likes or hates your MC, she will disappear at the end of this quest as soon as she gets the relic, leaving nothing but a note that says she wishes that she could have been a better person than she is. But if you have managed to either befriend her or romance her, she will return during the final confrontation with the Arishok. All the real damage has already been done, the city is in flames, the nobles have been cowed, and the Viscount is dead. But you're still given a chance to turn over Isabella to the Kunari in exchange for them leaving the city, if you'd rather not have a fight at this point. What makes this so heartbreaking is that you need to be friends with Isabella for this option to even be available, otherwise she never shows up. For anyone who doesn't invest the time you have into getting to learn about her and help the girl out over the first 2 acts, the choice would have been a no-brainer just to avoid the fight. But the fact that you only get to make this choice when you've already made it clear that you're close with the girl makes it hit so much harder than it otherwise could have done. Are you willing to sacrifice someone who is just trying to live their life, who fell into the pirating occupation as an escape instead of through bloodlust? And if you go through with the exchange and actually give up on Isabella, you have to deal with the look of absolute betrayal on her face as the Kunari drag her along back to Parvalan. Between the relationship requirements for her to feel comfortable returning to her, as well as the off chance you side with the Kunari, I feel as though a large majority of people never actually got to see her final companion quest in Act 3. It's rather basic, giving her a nice conclusion with the slave trader Castillon, who's been trying to track her down in the last 6 years, as you either blackmail him into never bothering her again, or outright kill him, depending on your character's nature. It's a less impactful ending than most of the other companions, but her story was always designed to reach its climax by the end of Act 2 in the first place, and boy does it succeed at that. Aside from this, I think that Isabelle has some of the most interesting traveling banter out of all the characters in DA2, as she simultaneously deflects Anders' criticism while toying with Varric and encouraging both Aveline and Meryl to be more confident. I haven't mentioned it up until this point, but the cadence and frequency of party banter as you're just walking around the city is actually pretty entertaining. I found that it triggers much more frequently in DA2 than it does in any other game in the series, perhaps because they knew you would be walking around the same area time after time as you made your way between quests. Regardless, I think everyone should at least take a look at the banter compilations for DA2 because there's some real gems in there that do a good job of fleshing out the relationship between all the party members. As such, the only character that I wasn't particularly a fan of for their banter was the DLC character Sebastian, a Scottish-sounding nobleman who's devoted himself to the Chantry. All of his dialogue lines focus on the religious aspects of his character, which is all well and good, except for the fact that his companion questline goes out of its way to prove that there's more to him than just a crazed zealot. In even his first cinematic introduction to the game, we see him disobeying the Chantry's request to abandon his anger as he posts a wanted poster for the heads of the entire Flint mercenary company. As we'll later learn, a noble family hired the mercenary group to systematically murder everyone in his family so that they could take control of the city that would have been his birthright, Starkhaven. Over time, we actually get to learn that Sebastian is in an awkward position as the third child in the family of 3 and was sent off to this Chantry at the age of 13 when he started to pose a threat to the family's good name. Since then, he rebelled for several years against his imposed confinement, but eventually came to terms with the word of Andraste and became as faithful a servant as Leliana did in her time. Unfortunately, the death of his family has spurred the vengeful side of Sebastian's personality, and he wants Hawk's help, tracking down the people who are trying to steal his heritage. You fight your way through the noble's house, encountering several people in the family that appear to have lost their mind before tracking down the matron to an ancient crypt below the city. It turns out that she was a mage who made a deal with a desire demon in order to fulfill her ambitions, but it's really the demon that takes the cake in this scene. Instead of attacking like most of the more mindless demon types, the desire demon instead tries to tempt Sebastian with the same deal she made with the matron. What would he be willing to give up to finally gain control of Starkhaven, the birthright of his people? Sebastian resists the temptation and you're forced to kill the demon and the matron, but the words follow Sebastian for quite some time as he starts to question just how deep set his ambition truly lies. This line of questioning is momentarily dropped as the final quest for Sebastian starts to explore the Chantry's response to the events taking place in Kirkwall during Act 3. Grand Cleric Althena asks for his help meeting with a representative of the Divine, Sister Nightingale, in the back rooms of the Viscount's palace, where you end up running into a small group of apostate radicals. Apparently, Sister Nightingale was expecting a reaction like this and only wanted to use the meeting as a target to confirm her suspicions about the state of the city. While the players will probably recognize her as Sister Leliana, her gaze is cold when it draws over the party that you've brought to the meeting, and she suspects that another exalted march will be necessary if things keep progressing like they are. Considering the crusade-like nature of the exalted marches in this world, Sebastian is incredibly concerned about this development and encourages Althena to withdraw to the Grand Cathedral where the Divine resides in order to wait out the danger. But Althena denies any opportunity to leave the city since she feels responsible for the well-being of her flock after being chosen as the highest representative of the Chantry in the area. And while I'm not personally a fan of Sebastian's character arc, I think that the development of Althena's personality, along with the Chantry politics that are playing in the background, give a good bit of context to the importance of what Anders would eventually do to the city. As the last truly mediating force in the area, Anders could not have picked a better target to sow dissent throughout the entire hierarchy of Kirkwall. And it wasn't until I explored Sebastian's companion quest that I even realized the true shame that occurred when Althena went up in flames. She stood as the representative for a commonly corrupt organization, as we'll see even more of as we progress into Inquisition, but that doesn't necessarily make her a bad person herself, and the fact she was willing to stay for the well-being of her people makes it all the more touching that she eventually went up in the explosion. This relationship between Sebastian and Grand Cleric Althena also lends a lot more emotional weight to the decision whether to spare Anders or not during the final sequence, since he will threaten to return to Starkhaven with an army just to track Anders down if you don't kill him yourself. There's no reasoning with him on this matter. Sebastian will be so incensed by Anders' deed, the only result that would ever be accepted was his death. And I think that's fitting for the type of person that Sebastian is, deep down inside. He's actually not so different from Anders when you think about it. A man so infuriated by the injustice of the world that he would do anything to take matters into his own hands and try to improve the lot of his people. But unlike Anders, a lot of his justification comes from his own needs as a human, constantly lashing out at those that hurt his loved ones, while pursuing his own ambitions in the name of religious dogma. Later on during Inquisition, Sebastian will even follow through with his threat and return from Starkhaven with an army ready to conquer the city of Kirkwall as Aveline attempts to mount a final defense, only further proving that he will stop at nothing to do what he perceives as best for the world. This single-minded pursuit, like that of a hunter, can also be seen in the final companion story with Fenris. But the perspective of things is almost entirely different. We're introduced to Fenris's story by cutting down a large group of bounty hunters that have come to collect his head, at which point the elf explains that he believes the best defense is a strong offense. Your next task involves going to an old safe house in the city that used to belong to his slave master from the Tevinter Imperium, but no one is home and Fenris settles down to lay a trap for anyone that might come to the ruined mansion. If you can't tell by his stark white hair or the lightly glowing tattoos lining every inch of his body, Fenris is kind of metal, both literally and figuratively. He's had raw lyrium injected into his skin in an experience so painful that has blocked off any memory from before that fateful moment. But it also allows him to do some extraordinary things like reaching into a man's chest in order to pull out his heart. And with that, the only real-world anagram I can compare that to is the story about Ozzy Osbourne biting into the head of a pigeon. It's just so hateful and extra that I find it hard to look at as anything but comedy, especially when the other companions will make fun of him for doing this for the rest of the game. As such, I can understand why many players simply view him as a bad boy character with relatively little depth, but if you're able to surmount your initial reaction to his character introduction, I found that he was a surprisingly interesting companion. As you get to know Fenris, his main conflict in the story is the fact that he can't figure out what to do now that he is free. As a Magister's pet, he knew nothing but the pain from his markings and the magical bindings of his master's commands, so now that the Magister is nowhere to be seen, Fenris is almost entirely lost. The one thing that he holds on to is vengeance against slave masters of any type, and especially against mages who he sees as an especially dangerous breed of monster that just hasn't manifested itself yet. This viewpoint more or less puts him at odds with the presentation that I feel that the game is trying to go for the vast majority of the time, with the mage oppression being expressed as reprehensible in most quests. So the one major voice against the magical apostates needs to be explained by the fact that he was more or less tortured to the point that he became amnesiac at the hands of a mage who later compelled him to kill the very group that first taught him what freedom means. See, Fenris actually ended up escaping his master 2 times. The first one by mistake, as the Magister left him behind in a desperate escape from Talvishoth rebels, and the second time when his master ended up coming back to the rebel base and ordered Fenris to kill the Talvishoth that had nursed him back to health. Apparently the trauma of this event broke the magical bond between the two, and Fenris was able to flee for good as he settled into life at Kirkwall, with only occasional repo attempts made by random passing mercenaries. Despite that, Fenris does end up asking for Hawk's help whenever he thinks that Magister Denarius might be nearby, like when his apprentice Hadriana makes a desperate attempt to capture Fenris during Act 2. Once you track her down to her lair and she loses the battle, she'll ask you to spare her life in exchange for information about Fenris's past. He relents, and she explains that he had a sister who also happens to be indebted to Master Denarius. and then he kills her in cold blood, no matter what the player character might say. And that makes sense, given how Fenrir feels about the world, that the only good mage is a dead mage, and taking their lives does society a service by exterminating a pest problem. Hadriana was never going to live through that encounter, no matter what she said, but the only thing stronger than his bloodlust is his desire to understand what might have come before his enslavement. So she earned a couple more seconds for that fact alone. So when we return from this questline in Act 3, as Daenerys finally comes to the city to deal with the problem child himself, Fenris is no less vindictive. The encounter begins when Fenris is invited to meet his sister, who just so happens to be in the Hanged Man Inn, but we soon realize that she was only there as bait for the Magister. Fenris flies into a rage when he sees the man who cut him down without a single chance of repentance. But when he turns his gaze back to his sister, who betrayed him for the chance to apprentice to the Magister, Hawke has a chance to step in this time. If you allow the sister to live, she reveals that Fenris won the right to be tattooed as he was, in return for the freedom of both the mother and the sister. That of all the ways things could have played out, he was a willing volunteer for the event that would destroy life as he knew it. Standing over the corpse of his former master, Fenris is now in many ways a thief, who stole from a business partner in more ways than one, and a sense of doubt that he may never be able to shake. Or, if you allowed him to follow through and kill the sister, he's left with absolutely nothing of his old life, nothing to connect him to what could have been or what was, and only the growing void as he tries to figure out what to do next. Despite coming out on top, Fenris ended up losing more than anyone else in the whole situation, solely because he lost himself in the transaction. I hope that after listening to the stories behind these companions, I can portray how empty it all makes me feel. Like someone triggered a trapdoor in my stomach, leaving my head dizzy and emotions running freely. These companion quests just hit different when you take a step back and look at what they're trying to say, what they might have been able to convey better if they had more than 14 months to speed along the development process. Because I truly believe in my heart of hearts that the stories behind these 7 character arcs are some of the strongest writing that BioWare ever threw on the screen, except that they never had the chance to pace it all out in a way that it should have been presented. I've already mentioned this, but the true failing of the game lies in its pacing and the objective fact that I cannot go more than 60 seconds without the game going from speech to combat to exploration or any combination of the 3. There are no moments spent chilling around a campfire with a group of friends, because by the end of the second act, everyone in your family but you is gone. Off to join the Templars, forced into the circle, saved by the Grey Wardens. Dead, dead, dead. You're the only one left in a grand mansion with 2 dwarves and an elf that wants to be your house slave. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. You were supposed to succeed, but everyone around you was failing. Bartrand, dead. Carl, dead. Marathari, dead. Isabella, dead. Dead, 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 dead. Everyone around you is falling to pieces as you run from quest to quest at a breakneck pace, never given a single moment to mourn the loss. There are no funerals in this game, no pyres, no farewells or closure, until the weight of it all makes you numb to the despair. Dragon Age 2 is a distinctly bleak story that somehow loses track of itself just based upon the sheer weight of everything going on around you. Critics call Dragon Age Origins a dark game, but I don't even think it holds a flame compared to the hulking shadow that is Dragon Age 2 when given the full context of its stories. I think I'm done analyzing the character arcs in Dragon Age 2 by this point, because I've obviously just worked myself up thinking about the topic in the first place, and we've got 2 more DLC stories to cover with some redundant gameplay but important context for the next game in the series. The first major DLC pack I'll be tackling is named Mark of the Assassin and covers a story that is predominantly linked to the Kunari spy network for anyone that is interested in learning more about their covert system. We're following the request of a young elf named Talus that requests Hawke's help infiltrating a nobleman's palace in order to steal their crowning jewel, since the MC was invited to a party on the premises. As such, the whole DLC basically gets broken down into a series of 3 arcs over 2 hours of game time, where you first hunt a wyvern on the castle fairgrounds, then take part in an Orlesian party to infiltrate the palace, and finally a combat sequence of events as you flee the area. Altogether, the pacing of it all is surprisingly good, with some genuinely interesting ideas like the fact that you can complete several side quests in the fairgrounds area in order to draw a larger wyvern for a harder fight, but a greater prize. Similarly, the Orlesian party introduces several mechanics like the Caprice coins that can be thrown into the well in the middle of the party for good luck, that many players will recognize from its later iteration in the Winter Palace from Inquisition. The DLC also implemented a stealth section, which was intermittently fun at times, but also quite frustrating since there's really only one path to success, and I'm glad this mechanic never made a return later in the series. Finally, in the center of the palace, you can take part in an optional puzzle section for extra rewards as you complete some locked door key puzzles, as well as several matching games in order to get some okay loot, I guess. But the one thing that stands out from the rest of the DLC is Felicia Day and how poorly she ends up fitting in with the rest of the gameplay. I actually didn't know that she was in the DLC until I played it, so when we're first introduced to the thief, Talus, I had a very weird sense of nostalgia, like I had met the character somewhere before. I just chalked it up to being a random side character from Origins, but around halfway through the wyvern hunt, I was finally able to place her voice and realized who the character was in real life, and that's a real shame, because she's actually a pretty good voice actor, and I don't really have any complaints about the way the character matches the voice, but then we also have to factor in how blindingly well known Felicia Day is in general nerd culture. While I was initially introduced to her through the Guild YouTube series, she has since broken into the public eye as a frequent participant on shows like Tabletop and Critical Role that both run through her multimedia organization Geek and Sundry. So even if you haven't heard of her specifically, there's a good chance that you've at least encountered some type of media linked to her cult of personality in the last 10 years. And as a voice actor for a character designed to specifically look like the actress, this was the one time throughout the series I genuinely felt like I was pulled out of the illusion. It seems as though she's grown so well known that it's hard to recognize a character of hers as anyone other than the woman herself, so I was more concerned with the weird nature of hearing her voice come out of a relatively complex Kunari spy as we make our way through the plot. This is by no means a criticism of her work, but I'm not one of those people that is usually able to recognize a voice actor without seeing the credits screen, and it did nothing to help the game's immersion. Otherwise, the story is pretty good, and after you've been captured halfway through the palace ground, Talus reveals that she was actually here to assassinate a Kunari spy master that had gone rogue. Apparently, her old master is trying to sell the names of Ben Hasrath's spies across the country to Orlesians, which would inevitably result in their deaths, but also likely lead to an all-out war between the Kun and Orlais. Instead, Talus begs you to help her spare the lives of these sleeper agents, and in return spare the lives of many more people in the long term when the war is averted. You are actually given the choice whether to help Talus or not near the end of the questline, but this is unfortunately just a false choice, which results in the same line of events no matter what you pick. You end up catching up to the Baron as he's making a deal with the Spymaster trader and are forced into fighting the noble whether you wanted to or not. Given the really cool wyvern animations as it constantly throws acid and explosives on your party throughout the fight, I genuinely enjoyed this boss as one of the most interesting mechanical battles in the entire game, so there's a part of me that understands why they chose to force you into this end result, but it still seems kind of rude of them to present a branching choice like it actually mattered in the long term. So you defeat the Dragon Rider, disrupt the information deal, kill off both the Duke and the Spymaster so the series doesn't have to deal with them later, and are magically transported back to Kirkwall after receiving some coin for all your hard work. Oh yeah, and you can kiss Talus if you chose all the flirt options throughout the DLC. So what could have been a pretty decent role-playing moment was more or less ruined in my eyes by the fact that the player is forced to side with the Kunari in this DLC, while they're forced to side against the Kunari in the main game, thus making my argument that we're playing through Hawk's storyline even more confusing since they don't seem to follow a consistent value set in this particular situation. Oh well. The other DLC doesn't do any better as far as role-playing opportunities go, but at least it sets the stage for the main villain in Inquisition, Corypheus. While this next story DLC named Legacy was technically the first main expansion on Dragon Age 2's main plot, I wanted to tackle it last since it flows into the sequel so naturally. The story specifically follows the Hawke family for this one as you track down a group of Carta that's been targeting your bloodline, trying to take both yourself and your sibling hostage. This journey ends up bringing you to a grand crevice in the middle of the desert near Kirkwall, where an ancient Grey Warden prison was built several thousand years ago. After some exploration, you learn that the dwarven Carta built over top this prison seems to be worshipping a godlike entity, and was promised salvation if they brought it the blood of the Hawke family. So we of course have to delve deeper and figure out what was controlling them. Along the way, Hawke defeats the mob boss and picks up a weapon that the dwarf was referring to as a key, which will magically shift into whatever main weapon your MC has the most skills invested into. As you progress further into the prison, it becomes more and more apparent that your father was used to perform a certain type of blood magic binding, so that creatures can enter the prison but never leave. So you obviously end up passing one of those invisible barriers before learning about this, and the party is more or less forced to make your way through the tower in order to leave the area. Thankfully, you'll soon meet a scraggly little man named Hilarious that used to be the commander of the Grey in the area, but has since lost himself to the call of the Darkspawn taint that runs through every Grey Warden. He's not quite a full Darkspawn yet, so he requests Hawke's help renewing the binding on the ancient entity that the Grey Wardens have trapped in this place. The only way up is down, since you'll need to reach the base of the chasm first in order to bridge the gap and start making your way up the tower proper. During this journey, you'll end up encountering several spirit manifestations of your father as you get to see him sealing away most of the demons the Grey Wardens use to guard this place. This is meant to show that while he may have been a blood mage, your father never approved of the shackling of demons for the greater cause like many Grey Wardens have done over time. But your father also left you several points of magical energy which you can draw from and improve the key weapon that is supposed to unlock the prison. To accomplish this, you fight 3 increasingly difficult guardian demons, which develop abilities like mirror image and spitting acid as the player as you get to each one. But after the battle, you can choose between 4 stat upgrades to your weapon, like the ability to ignore armor, a health leech effect, or just straight up elemental damage. The DLC also throws in some interesting side quest points about the exile of a dwarf that was framed for murder and is heavily alluded to be Varric's ancestor in some way. Otherwise, it's a pretty bog-standard dungeon crawl as you make your way through layer after layer of this ancient prison with traps strewn all about the level design. You can try to use the traps on the enemy, which is kind of interesting, but I found it generally easier to just kill them the old-fashioned way, which resulted in about an hour straight of almost mindless Darkspawn killing action. But at the base of the tower, you end up running into the wardens currently tasked with guarding the prison, along with the awkward realization that it was the new commander of the Grey that paid the Carta to start ambushing your family. This woman, Janica, believes that the entity trapped within the tower may be the key to salvation for the Grey Wardens. She tries to convince Hawke to help her free the creature since it appears to be an intelligent being with some manner of control over the Darkspawn, like an archdemon that you can try to negotiate with. And like the Grey Wardens are typically portrayed, Janica is willing to do just about anything in the world if it gives them the chance to actually stop another blight from happening before the fact. So now the player is left with a choice: follow Larius and reseal the prisoner, or help Janica to break him out and attempt to stop the Darkspawn. No matter your choice, your next task is to try and rush up the tower as fast as possible and beat the other group before they can do something drastic at the prison's apex. Even though Hawke is the only one that can technically do anything, since your blood is the only thing that can unlock the mechanism, but whatever. The choice between these two parties is at least made a little bit interesting by the fact that the wardens can hear a voice whispering to them when in close proximity to the tower, and it even gets so bad that Anders will lose total control of his body and turn into a corrupted form of justice in order to attack the party until you can get him back under control. But then you have to take into account that while Janica is probably hearing the whispers of the prisoner, Lucius is literally a hair's breadth away from becoming a full-blown Darkspawn, to the point that the Darkspawn ignore him, since he appears to be just another thrall to them. As such, both choices have some serious shades of moral gray, but they both lead to the same place at the end of the day as you face off at the top of the tower. If you end up siding with Janica, the mini-boss fight will start between your group and Lucius, but if you end up taking Lucius's side, he will just jump onto Janica and bash her face in with no remorse. I was so surprised by the sheer violence of this scene that it made me seriously doubt whether I had made the right choice the first time around, but then we get to the real meat of the lore behind this DLC as Hawk uses their blood to finally activate the seal at the top of the tower. The introduction of Corypheus in this scene is much less grand than the eventual reveal in the sequel, but this also makes sense considering his general confusion about what's happened to him. The half-man, half-darkspawn creature is actually one of the ancient Tevinter mages who attempted to breach the veil and enter the realm of the gods in their physical form. The Chantry had always told legends that it was man's folly that led to the creation of the Darkspawn, but this was the first time anyone had ever claimed to be one of those mages who first imbibed the taint. And what makes this seem even more true is the fact that Corypheus seems totally unaware that several hundred years have passed since he last walked the earth, and that these lands no longer belong to the Tevinter Imperium of old. His first act of freedom is to ask about the location of the first acolyte of Dumont, an ancient god who first taught mankind how to use magic, also revealing that Corypheus was in fact the high priest of their order. Following your confusion at his request, Corypheus beseeches his god, asking for answers or something to guide his hand, and he receives only silence. The high priest that once spoke directly to God was now alone and shaken by the uncertainty that was once filled by a voice in the dark, but that did not leave him powerless, as a Tevinter magister with a degree of magical skill required of the highest members of their brutal hierarchy. He lashes out on the player, resulting in one of the most mechanically interesting boss fights in the entire series as he grows in power over the course of the battle. First, he unleashes the element of fire with a spinning wheel of flames that can drop any character within seconds of standing in the AoE. Second, he unleashes earth and ice to block the player's path and stop them in their tracks, making it even harder to outrun the fire. And in the final phase, he supercharges the rocks with electricity, making the arena even more dangerous to make your way through while fighting off the adds, triggering the statuettes to weaken Corypheus and avoiding the Wheel of Fire. Altogether, it's a downright fantastic fight that highlights both the strengths and weaknesses of the Dragon Age 2 combat system based upon its focus on really tight character control. Because of this, I found that most times I tried this battle, my teammates would die incredibly quickly, since the third-person control system just doesn't give you a very good representation of the tactical side of battle. On the other hand, making my way through the final stages of the fight after my teammates had already died really showcased the responsiveness of the combat system. My failure to keep them alive definitely slowed down the fight a considerable amount, but the resulting epic feel to the situation as we enter the final phase with a one-on-one battle between Hawk and Corypheus felt like the whole point of the game. Everything in Dragon Age 2 is about Hawk's story as an entity separate from the individual wants of the player behind the controls. And this final moment ended up reminding me of the duel with the Aeroshock. The fact that Hawk is not only fully capable of beating the final bosses of each act in one-on-one combat, but is also encouraged to, either by the plot or the combat mechanics to do so, is an incredibly interesting design choice. Hawk truly is the champion of Kirkwall, and by the time that I killed Corypheus on my first playthrough, I definitely felt that statement in my very bones as your character grows into a one-man army. So Corypheus is defeated, and we get to see the very life drain from his eyes in the last few moments of the battle before we slay him. Depending on which side you helped, either Lucius or Janica will commend your actions before telling you that they had best set off to warn the other Grey Wardens about what had just happened here. And in a moment of heavy foreshadowing, both parties claim to feel weird, alongside the fact that Larius has his entire voice change and has finally remembered how to stand up straight after so many years in the tunnels. The game isn't necessarily subtle in its build-up to the plot twist in Inquisition, but then again it doesn't really need to be, since there's a couple of different ways the authors could have taken this line of events. Regardless, I think the most important thing about the DLC is the fact that it establishes just how religious Corypheus was, that his first acts as a free man would all seem to revolve around his faith and God. And if you were to play Dragon Age Inquisition without this seemingly small bit of background on the character, it can make the motivations behind his villainy very hard to understand. The man is a zealot of such grand aspirations that he ripped a hole in the fabric of the world to step foot in the realm of the gods and found it empty. The type of man that pledges his body and soul to a religion wherein the voice in his head was a very real entity up until that point would have no idea what to do with his life once it had left him. In this way, Corypheus is as lost as Fenris is, given extraordinary power by a higher being, then simply left to their own devices. But while Fenris fought back against his servitude, Corypheus had his purpose stripped away in his crowning moment, for which he can do nothing except hope to serve those who follow him in its stead. It turns out that even the villains in Dragon Age 2 get to have a depressing backstory. And that's the majority of Dragon Age 2 for you. Sure, there's a couple of interesting side stories that I never touched on, an occasional glitch in the system, and 100 other things I could try to nitpick, like the absolutely abysmal running animations, but I at least hope that I got across my main idea behind the critique, that Dragon Age 2 has some of the best character development I've ever not seen in a video game. So if you never notice these tiny details on your first trip through the game, I totally understand, because Dragon Age 2 tries really hard to be an action game with absolutely no narrative substance. Instead, the writers ended up throwing all their narratives just below the surface so that any player invested enough to piece together the hidden stories would find something just as capable as the Dragon Age origins of legend. And all this is packaged in a neat little box that is a combat system that actually feels good to play when compared to stun-locking enemies for hours on end while doing message board quests. I ended up playing through Dragon Age 2 twice for the review. Not because I needed to in order to get footage or flesh out my game experience, but because it still remains just as fun bashing in enemy skulls at the end of 37 hours as it did in the first 5 minutes. So I'm proud to say that I genuinely prefer Dragon Age 2 experience over the original, and I think it deserves that recognition, since so many people only ever took the game at face value. As for the third game in the series, opinions around Dragon Age Inquisition are absolutely all over the place, largely dependent on what type of game a player was looking for in the first place. I mentioned this before, but this is only the second part in a 3-video series on Dragon Age games, and if you enjoyed what I had to say about the first 2 entries to the trilogy, then the third video should be available soon. Things are taking much longer putting these videos together than I had first expected. I had initially planned on making this entire critique into a single video, but once it hit 70,000 words, I ended up realizing that it might be better to break it up into a different video for each game in the series. As such, I apologize if any of the references in this particular section of the series don't make sense to newcomers, and I especially hope that I kept enough of your interest to encourage you to watch the next video right after this, as it was initially intended. Otherwise, I still hope you had a good experience watching this critique, and that someday we might be able to cross paths once again as I continue to make YouTube videos. Thank you for your time, and keep loving video games. And book a ship to your family's ancestral home, Kirkwall. Ew. 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 The use of these... Ew. Grody. Necessarily like, but if you're... What the fuck was that? Where was I? Fuck. She has a task for someone as strong as you to play. What? No. First, you have to deliver the amulet that Flemeth gave you to the... Oh no. Basically end up being exactly the same. Do I want to rephrase that? On your second play, after you've raised all the necessary money to become a... No. The player probably first met trying to make a business deal with the Kunari. Wait, what? See, Jarbe... No. To obtain the recipe, the upstag... What? Gascard Dupuis, Hawk must be executed. Meh. Aveline... Nope. The slave trader Castillon, who's... Oops. Nope. Ew. Where was I? Oh. This single-minded pursuit, like that of a hunt... Oh, no? What? But if you're able to... Cat, get out of here, cat. No. Where you first hunt a wyvern, where you first Nope. Otherwise, the story is pretty good, and after you've Nope. Otherwise, the... No. Ew. I need to stop. I'm done. Nope. Good night. I need a break.